Okay, so this is lecture number one, European exploration and expansion, 15th through the 17th centuries. There's actually two parts to this. This is the first half that kind of looks at what's happening in the 15th and into the 16th centuries. And then the second lecture will look at what happens later. So we have slightly different casts of characters in these two different phases, as well as sort of different motives and outcomes. So obviously we're kind of backing up a little bit, talking about the 15th century. This is really sort of late medieval Europe, but this is really when the sort of foundation for this exploration and expansion is established. So we have to back up a little bit before we can move forward. So, what sort of prompts this sort of exploration that happens? Clearly, at the forefront are economic motives. So, a lot of developments happening in late medieval Europe, establishment of sort of more powerful nation states and an expansion of trade. As these states establish themselves, one of the sort of markers of a stable sort of kingdom is the ability to mint coinage. And until now, most of that coin has been made out of real silver. And there's a shortage of silver within Western Europe and also where they used to mine it sort of elsewhere. So looking for other sort of specie with an E, silver or gold that they can use to mine more coins. There's a long tradition of trade between Western Europe, countries in the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China, particularly the demand for spices. So these are used in cooking. The cooking in medieval Europe is actually quite sophisticated with the use of sort of things like pepper, saffron, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon. And these are also used sort of medicinally and in religious sort of practices as well. And these are things that can only be gotten from certain places that are outside of Western Europe. And so thinking about ways that they can increase that flow of the spice trade. And eventually we'll see a shift, a demand for more luxury goods. In the late 17th century, coffee. They've also discovered sugar. They know about textiles like silk from China, so they're interested in acquiring those as well. So they've been active in a lot of this trade, particularly with the Middle Eastern countries and then Southeast Asia, and then interested in sort of opening up markets even further east with China. But until now, all of this trade has to go through these sort of internal routes known as the Silk Road. And these are arduous, mountainous. They're not always very safe. They take a lot of capital to invest in them. And so, sort of brainstorming amongst these merchants and these traders, how can we bypass all these middlemen, all these other sort of countries and get things more efficiently and more cost effectively? So at the same time, and these are all sort of interrelated, you start to see some technological advances that make navigating the seas much more feasible. You haven't really had since the Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries, individuals who are able to sort of sail in the open seas. So most medieval European trade, when they do follow when they in maritime trade, they don't ever go too far away from the coast. As long as they can see the coast, they're good. But they need obviously ways to sort of navigate the open seas so that they can get sort of further and further from the coastline. The astrolabe has been around for a long time, but this is really most effective near the equator in terms of figuring out where you are in your position. And they also developed the quadrant, which is another tool that's most effective in the northern hemisphere. So these are navigational devices that help them in the open seas kind of chart their course. We also have advances in navigation itself in terms of the ships. So the caravel is sort of introduced by the Portuguese. And as you can see, this is not a huge ship, but in part, two masts make it better able to sort of maximize the wind potential. You can fit about 50 tons in the hold of the caravel. And in part, a lot of earlier ships are relying upon oars. Those not only take up room in the hold, but you have to have men to row them. You have to feed those men. And so you have to have a very large crew. And the caravel makes a much more efficient sort of tool for navigation. You can fit more cargo, smaller crew, and you can move faster. And then as things become a little bit more competitive, the Spanish introduced a galleon. So this is a similar ship in terms of its design, but they introduce sort of cannons on the sides and mounted guns. We start to see the need for protection, and so this allows them to do that. And as they become more familiar with new places, they use these navigational devices. The field of cartography, of map making, really takes off. And so as people travel to places where others have never been, they start recording and documenting their travels. And then others are able to kind of begin to devise these fairly accurate, you can see this one's a little distorted, particularly around the South and Central Americas, but they're able to devise more and more accurate maps to sort of further the process moving forward. And they build on what people before them have done. So there's also the emergence of routiers or guidebooks. So individual captains of voyages will themselves document or have someone along with them documenting their voyages. So what did they see? Where did they go? Indicating particular landmarks. So look for this source of fresh water along the coast. Look for this port, which we have been to and we've traded and we have a relationship with the locals. Trying to also give them sort of a heads up, like this group, not friendly. If you try to trade with them, they will try to kill you. So trying to sort of lay a foundation for the people who are coming afterwards. This is actually an illustration from one of the earliest sort of guidebooks produced actually by the Dutch in the 17th century. And you can see sort of the globes that they're using and some of the other sort of instruments in their hands, sort of the navigational tools that they're using. So really bringing all of this together. So in this first phase, the primary participants are those sort of countries that are closest to the Mediterranean and to Africa. So Portugal is at the forefront of this exploration. And in part, you can see from the map where Portugal is here, they are a maritime economy already. Their trade through the Mediterranean with the Middle East has already been very active. They also have active trade networks with some of these North African countries. And their proximity gives them a huge advantage. They also have individuals who are just sort of really personally invested in exploration. And one of those, probably the most prominent, Prince Henry the Navigator. So he's the brother of the King of Portugal, and he establishes sort of an institute of navigation. So bringing together a lot of these different individuals who have manned these voyages, but also some of these cartographers. And so this sort of clearinghouse where individuals who've gone on these different voyages can come back and sort of pool their knowledge. Overall, of about 35 voyages to Africa that happened during his lifetime, he personally directs 8 of them. These voyages are expensive. You have to have the ship, you have to have the crew, you have to have all the provisions. And so to have a wealthy sort of patron like Henry the Navigator is really crucial. So he eventually, as more and more of these voyages produce new places for the Portuguese to expand into, he organizes the colonization of Madeira Islands as well as the Azores, which are kind of just off the coast of Portugal. Also, he is very active in the early stages of the slave trade. So a lot of the African slaves that are purchased by some of the voyages directed by Henry the Navigator end up back in the earliest slave centers in Lisbon in Portugal. Most of these slaves sort of are sent across Western Europe. Many of them become sort of domestic slaves. They're not really used in industry yet. And more than anything, they're early on sort of a marker of status. He also is motivated by very much a religious sentiment. So the Portuguese are very Catholic. And this is sort of the last vestiges of the Crusades that we saw in the Middle Ages. So Christians from Western Europe sort of engaged in military conflict with Muslims. And so in part that informs a lot of what he's doing, because a lot of these North Africans are actually Muslim. And so he gives this very economic sort of activity, sort of expansion, production of wealth, monopoly of the new gold trade, as sort of this religious legitimization in his view. So other voyages that happen that are Portuguese sponsored. So in the 1430s, the Azores, and those are the islands like right across from Lisbon on that map. They then begin to sort of move down the African mainland. So they're trying to find this passage to Southeast Asia, to India. They do not know at first how far south Africa extends. So a lot of these earliest voyages, as soon as they see a large body of water leading into the interior of Africa, they kind of follow it up as far as they can because they're hoping it's going to lead all the way through. Obviously, that doesn't happen. So little by little, they continue down until 1488, where Diaz manages to round the Cape of Good Hope. Originally, he names it the Cape of Storms because it's so difficult to navigate those waters, but they figure if they call it that, no one else is going to go, so they call it the Cape of Good Hope. In 1497, Vasco da Gama actually makes it all the way to India, to Calcutta, or what was later Calcutta. And so this is really the first documented sea route to Asia. Then they're going to continue these forays east. So they get to Malay in 1511 and actually reach mainland China in 1515. So the next major participant in this first phase is obviously Spain, as most of us are familiar with. So Christopher Columbus's story about trying to find a way also to get to China and some of those lands more directly, instead of going down around Africa, which is dangerous and time consuming. He's going to go kind of due west, which he thinks is due east, and hopefully find a path that way. As you can see, Columbus actually takes several voyages between 1492 and 1504. In 1493, he returns. So after that initial voyage with just the 3 ships, he returns with a fleet of 17 ships and about 1,500 men. Obviously, his discovery of Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, sort of sets out an enormous amount of enthusiasm. They knew Africa was there. They didn't know how big it was. Obviously, they knew about the Middle East and Southeast Asia somewhat. They had no idea that all these lands exist in the Americas. And so this is literally completely uncharted territory. Columbus is followed by a few other Spanish-sponsored explorers, I guess I'm going to call them. So Ferdinand Magellan is the first to navigate the globe. Only like 15 of 265 men in his crew survive, and he himself doesn't survive, but the ship does. The ship makes it all the way around. Then you have Hernan Cortez with actually a very small force, about 300 Spanish soldiers. So he's moving inland towards Central America, what we now know of as Mexico, and he is able to ally with a lot of sort of local indigenous tribes who have been subject to Aztec domination and are not very happy about it. And so even though there's a really small number of Spanish soldiers, he has a fairly large indigenous army, and so he's able to overthrow the Aztec Empire based here. And so this is the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, which is now where Mexico City is. And then Pizarro goes into Incas, into the Inca Empire in Peru, which sort of stretches along the coast, extraordinarily rich silver mines. And again, Peru, like the Aztec Empire, is in the midst of a civil war. And so Pizarro is able to sort of do a divide and conquer. He has just sort of a few dozen men on horseback. He has like 1 cannon, but that's not really the force that gives him victory. It's that he's able to sort of ally with all these local indigenous groups as well. And then once they sort of defeat the one group, he sort of turns on the other, and then he's able to defeat them as well. Obviously, the use of firearms gives the Europeans a huge advantage in terms of military conflict, and so it's able to sort of equalize the numbers. So, what are the consequences of all this early sort of exploration and then eventually sort of claiming control over these regions and the local populations that they find? One of them is obviously slavery. So, slavery has been a constant throughout Western civilization. In Western Europe proper, it sort of dies out. The attitude is you cannot enslave other Christians. So early on, when you have a lot of non-Christians, slavery is still very much prominent. But as you move through the Middle Ages and most Western Europeans convert to Christianity, slavery sort of becomes an inadvertent, it sort of ends inadvertently because of that. You do still have slavery active in Middle Eastern countries and in African countries, but it then returns to the Western European sort of mindset in the 15th century, and it's going to become it's going to change. Instead of the slave being someone who perhaps is conquered as a result of warfare, it becomes much more racialized. And so moving forward then, sort of this enslavement of other peoples, which is in contradiction to a lot of Christian doctrine, they're able to justify based on sort of developing theories of sort of race and racial inferiority. They also initially use a lot of these slaves, as I said, as domestic labor. So in Portugal in the early 17th century, about 3% of their population is of African origin, either as slaves or formerly enslaved individuals. And then eventually, when it's really going to start to grow, is when they start to establish the plantation system in Brazil and in the Caribbean. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture. But what we start to see here is the emergence of what will become these slave economies, especially in the Americas. Britain actually outlaws slavery relatively early, given how long it takes in some of these other places, but it's really the Americas where the way the economy evolves, they just see it as so fundamental to their ability to continue the kinds of production that they want to moving forward. As many of you, I'm sure, have already sort of encountered in other places, then this sort of enslaved experience is a pretty horrific one. We know, and these numbers are rough because documents aren't that good, but scholars have been able to do some pretty incredible things with what they have. By 1850, at least 10 million Africans were transported to the Americas, the Caribbean. That does not include the ones who died along the way. We know that the basic sort of approach was the European traders would come to African countries. They would sell them textiles and firearms in return for individuals that the Africans had enslaved themselves, either through warfare or kidnapping. This then is really not just impacting what happens in the Caribbean and the Americas, but it really impacts these African countries as well and alters their power dynamics. It sort of gives them an incentive for continued conflict. And in some places, especially in West Africa, the result is an enormous sort of depopulation. So about 2/3 of African men in the western part of Africa are removed from their homes. And so this has all kinds of repercussions on the local African societies that remain. We know that during the Middle Passage, which is depicted here, the men and women are separated. The men are typically shackled. They're generally given a bare minimum of food, and there's a lot of diseases rampant, and some really sort of descriptions of this experience. We'll read one with Equiano, gives us insight into exactly how horrific these conditions were. So there is some critique of slavery, even while it's just sort of re-emerging as a dominant force in this exploration and expansion. So there is a Dominican friar from Spain who comes to Mexico, and he becomes one of the first sort of church leaders there as the Bishop of Chiapas. So Bartolome de las Casas writes a short account of the destruction of the Indies, and he's extremely critical of the treatment of the indigenous populations who are also initially enslaved. And so he writes extensively trying to sort of inform the Spanish public about how some of these individuals who are in the Americas are treating the local population. He does manage to get the Spanish crown to prohibit slavery of the indigenous population, but in part the way he does that is he argues that Africans are actually more suited to this types of labor that the slaves are engaged in, the indigenous peoples. So he sort of he protects one population, but at the expense of another. Another voice that we hear is Equiano, and Equiano writes sort of this really fascinating, unique autobiography of his own experience as an enslaved African who's brought over to the Caribbean and then eventually is able to purchase his own freedom. So it really does provide this really unique sort of insight into the experience, though it is the text itself has been sort of challenged by scholars. We do know that he sort of distorts his story a little bit, but still a lot of it is based on personal experience, and he's obviously extraordinarily critical of slavery and the treatment of enslaved people. So as these initial forays into these previously unknown territories continue to evolve, more and more the interest is in permanent conquest, permanent settlement. This is a contemporary map of places that the Portuguese had claimed to colonize. So they're establishing ports so that they can secure access to these new to them places, then immediately putting in place military fortifications so they can protect against any challenges. In a lot of instances, they either eliminate or enslave the local inhabitants, particularly in Africa. And then they try to encourage settlement from the mainland so that they can increase the European population to give them more control of these areas, provide more stability, and then eventually begin exploitation of local resources, either in the form of mining or through agricultural production, which is really going to take off in the next phase. And then obviously exporting goods that they're finding, golds, silvers, other spices, things that there's a demand for back in Western Europe. Portugal and Spain become rivals for these new lands. And so in 1494, this sort of rivalry comes to a head because there's competing claims. Who has control over this territory? Who has control over this territory? Obviously, they discount the claims of any of the indigenous populations that they see, which is just sort of part of their European mindset. It never occurs to them that the local people actually control these territories. But they take this argument to the Pope. These are both Catholic countries. And so the Pope negotiates what becomes known as a Treaty of Tordesillas. So you can see they kind of divide a line. And then at this stage in 1494, remember, Columbus has just sort of found Hispaniola. They really don't know how much more there is to sort of the west of Hispaniola. And so the Portuguese agreed to this sort of dividing line, thinking they got the best of what's out there, only to discover a little bit later as they find more and more territory in the Americas that in fact the Spanish end up doing quite well themselves. The other impact is on the indigenous populations. So these are sort of the Amerindians that they find in the Caribbean and the Americas. Initially subject to a lot of enslavement before they sort of enact prohibitions against enslaving the local population. They are very determined also to convert them to Christianity, and in this instance, because we're talking about Spain and Portugal, to Catholicism. Also, inadvertently, just the local populations have never encountered the diseases that have been very common in Western Europe and the Middle East for centuries. And so they don't have any immunity. So they're just devastated by what in the West are now kind of considered containable outbreaks, things like the flu, but also measles. The smallpox proves devastating. And you can see just in Hispaniola alone, the toll that's taken on the local population by the presence of, or the introduction of these new diseases. One of the outcomes then also is what's known as the Columbian Exchange. So you start to see goods moving, particularly between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. So introducing new goods that weren't indigenous to local populations. So sugar and rice, which are common in sort of Africa and Southeast Asia, introduced into the Caribbean. Then you also have sort of different types of goods. So you're introducing tobacco and cacao, the basis of chocolate, sweet potatoes and tomatoes. Those come from South America. They're introduced into Europe. And then also other sort of new plants and animals are all part of this sort of exchange, along with things like firearms that are introduced to the Americas and all of those diseases. So ultimately then economically, you do have this infusion of specie, gold, silver that's extracted from these mines, especially in places like Bolivia, but also Peru and around Mexico. So the richest mines are located in Potosi, what's now Bolivia, and you can see 10 million ounces of silver per year at their height in the 1590s. All of this is being brought back to Western Europe. It's going to enter the economy, and it's going to have some pretty dramatic impact. You also see shifts in patterns of consumption. All of a sudden, Western Europe is introduced to new products like tea, like coffee, like sugar, like chocolate. And this is going to alter the economy permanently moving forward as you have an increase in demand for these goods in Western Europe. Also things like silk, porcelain. They discover porcelain from China, and there's huge demand for porcelain. Eventually, about 70 million pieces of porcelain are brought from China to Western Europe within about a 200-year period. And then, as I said before, sort of the foundation of these slave economies moving forward, which we'll talk more about in the next lecture. This is a depiction of one of the first sort of coffee houses in the late 1600s in England. And these sort of emerged centered around the consumption of coffee, but are also going to play into sort of changing social dynamics in Western Europe as well.